Jehovah's Witnesses. Have you found this to be the case in your readings? And you really, in certain respects, were a pioneer in all of this. Did you ever bring this to the attention of, say, the watchtower officials and so on? What was their reaction to this information?
Yes, I've noticed this very same thing myself. It seemed at first, when I began to work with witnesses in this capacity, that the society would fight against what was necessary to help them. They would seem to counteract the therapy that was needed in order to help these people adjust and become mentally healthy. And I often noted that this was occurring and talked to a number of governing body officials like Brother Schroeder and several others about this. And I'm not sure that they listened carefully to what I said, but I think what I had to say did have an impact upon them. And probably, too, what happened was they received reports throughout the world of suicides, of severe emotional problems our witnesses were having, and I think it became very apparent to them that there were many very serious, emotionally ill people in the organization. And we're not just talking about persons at the lower level. We're talking about circuit overseers, and I understand several members of the governing body had serious emotional problems. So I think after a while they could no longer deny it. They realized that these problems were there, and they had to deal with them. And also in my writing, I've written several journal articles. I've written a book on this topic. I've also written a number of other papers, and I usually sent copies of these to individuals at the Watchtower Society. And although they never directly stated to me that these influenced them, I have a hard time feeling that they didn't. And I'm sure there are others who are sending similar reports to the Society. There is an individual who likewise was a witness out in another state that I lived in, and he, I understand, wrote a paper on the very same topic I did, on the mental health problems. And he sent a copy to the Society and personally talked to a number of individuals there as well. And I think from so many angles, this information saying the same thing was coming forth, that they realized they had to deal with it. And I think now they are trying to, in some way at least, deal with these problems. They can no longer ignore them because they are so serious and so widespread. And so they are making some efforts to deal with them, but I think the basic problems are still there. They still send witnesses on a guilt trip. They still ask you to put your life on hold. They still ask you to live in what, in many ways, is a very abnormal world. And if you look at the witness world very carefully, one wonders why people would not go insane living in this world, or at least not have emotional problems. It's a very abnormal world. And so they are acknowledging these things, but in a very small way, I believe. I believe what they are doing is a drop in the bucket. It's a penny in the sea of dollars that needs to be looked at. So what they will do in the future is hard to say. They still tend to believe if you pray more, study more, go out in service, all your problems will disappear. This still tends to be the major teaching. Although they do recognize, well, in some cases, maybe antidepressants would be appropriate. In some cases, maybe a vacation would be appropriate. And maybe it's not wrong now, they're saying, to go to a 2-year technical college. That was condemned, college was, for years. Now they're saying, well, maybe a 2-year technical college would not be that bad. It's still wrong to go to a college, and of course wrong to go to a university, but maybe a couple years of schooling is okay. So there is some flexibility now which there was not before. But ironically, in other areas there's more rigidity. So they seem to deal effectively in some areas, then in other areas they take 2 or 3 steps backward and seem to contribute more to the problems they have.
Jerry, you know, it's interesting as we sit here and talk about these things, and I've read a variety of papers, and I know that you have access to far more things than I've probably read. In corroboration of the things we're talking about, what have other researchers actually developed? What have they come up with? Anything different, or is it just a total corroboration of what we're speaking about here today?
Well, I've reviewed quite a bit of research on the witnesses, and in this area especially, and I found all the studies that I consulted found exactly the same thing, and that is, namely, the mental illness rate is about 4 times higher than you would find in the population as a whole. So this is a pretty serious problem, which is universally recognized by all researchers in the field. So my research is not different than the other studies that I've looked at. And this is also true not only in this country, but also in other countries, and some of the studies were done 30 and 40 years ago. So we're talking about a very consistent, high level of mental illness in all times in this century and all places.
Would you say, Jerry, there's following the same theme, this idea of the other researchers and your own findings and so on, is there a statistical percentage that we could utilize here? You know, it's a third as high, or it's a quarter as high, or it's higher or less, whatever. Is there a percentage that can be applied in this case?
Well, it depends on what specific type of mental illness you're looking at. When you look specifically at schizophrenia, the studies consistently are about 4, 5, 6 times higher than the non-witness population. In other words, among witnesses, schizophrenia is about 4 or 5 times higher than among non-witnesses. If you look at depression, it's probably 6, 8, 10 times higher. It also depends specifically on the cutoff point. If you're very liberal in defining depression, you could define it as 5 times, 10 times higher. If you're very strict, the definition would be different. We're clearly talking about a rate, though, that's far higher. Whether it's exactly 4 times or 5 times is kind of irrelevant. It's clearly higher. And that's the major concern we need to look at.
The society practices, of course, shunning. And for many, many years, of course, this applied to the person who had been removed from the congregation, disfellowshipped, which is equivalent, of course, to excommunication. And this has obviously had an effect on those individuals. At the same time, we think now, since 1981, September 15th, 1981, the Watchtower developed that those persons who would willingly leave the society would be put in the same category. So that today we have thousands upon thousands of persons who are being shunned by their former friends, by their relatives, by their parents, by everyone. Now this must have some incredible effect on the individual, Jerry. What would you say the major impact of that would be?
That's a very good question that you posed. I think it's one that is especially of concern today in the Watchtower Society. The press often uses the term shunning, but I think it's much more than that among the witnesses. Some religions, it's true, do practice shunning, but it's more of a social estrangement, more of a social setting the person apart. The witnesses, it's a total cutting off, which is really quite a bit different. The witnesses consider someone who's disfellowshipped, which is the term they use, as literally, in more ways than one, dead. And even one's own parents are not allowed to speak to one unless they say it's absolutely necessary, which really is very few conditions. So it's really a total, absolute cutting off of all persons who are witnesses in good standing. And I think to illustrate the effect of disfellowshipping on a person, I think it's best that I probably relay a case which I worked with, which to me illustrates what commonly happens. This is the case of a young man who was a very enthusiastic witness. He was involved in the organizations for 4 or 5 years, and he was a very good, astute witness. He read a great deal of the Watchtower publications. In fact, I noticed that he was answering more questions at the meetings than those who were witnesses for 20, 30 years. And he would develop questions as time went on, and he asked these to the elders. And the elders tried to answer them politely at first, but in time, I think, the questions became more and more difficult, and it was harder and harder for the elders to answer these questions. And after a while, they saw him as a troublemaker. They saw these questions not as sincere questions, which they were, but they saw him as trying to stir up trouble, trying to cause dissension in the organization. And after a while then, they told him he should not be asking these questions. He should simply accept what the society says and not create dissension by asking these questions. So then he started to write to the society in endeavoring to try to find answers to these questions. And in time, the society became more and more stringent with him and said, look, do not ask these questions. Accept what we tell you. Read the Watchtower. And do not think beyond that. They accused him of what they call running ahead.